Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on the second half of Fratelli Tutti, the invitation to new forms of integrity, faith, and connection, with Dr. Gillian Ahlgren. My name is Robbie Francis, and I am the Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministry for the Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this presentation with Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice and Resources for Renewal. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce Dr. Ahlgren. First, we ask that you stay on mute throughout the presentation. Since we are a large group tonight, this will help eliminate any background noise. I want to apologize in advance if you do end up unmuting yourself and I end up muting you again. For the Q&A at the end of the presentation, we ask that you use the chat box, and I will plan to moderate the questions, combining them as I am able. You can find the chat box by hovering over the bottom or top of your screen and clicking the icon that says chat on the Zoom toolbar. Feel free to add any questions into the chat during the presentation itself as well. Now to introduce Dr. Gillian Ahlgren. Dr. Ahlgren is a professor of theology, a church historian, and a specialist in the Christian mystical tradition. She received her doctorate in the history of Christianity from the University of Chicago. She is the author of 7 books, including The Tenderness of God, Reclaiming Our Humanity, and Spiritual Exercises for the 21st Century, a workbook. Dr. Ahlgren has been teaching at Xavier University for the past 30 years. She also does significant pastoral work in the local community and beyond, with a particular interest in the spiritual enrichment of women who have survived domestic violence. Welcome, Dr. Ahlgren. Welcome, Dr. Ahlgren. We are happy to have you with us tonight.
Thank you all so much. It's wonderful to be with you. As you probably know, this is part 2 of our exploration of the most recent papal encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. And the first portion was presented last year and is available on the Bellarmine website if you want to go back and see that one as well. We're going to pick up tonight toward the end of chapter 3 of the most recent encyclical on solidarity and kinship, especially as what Pope Francis calls fraternal love, universal love, the love of sisters and brothers, takes form and shape in community and in society, and even globally. So those of you who have heard a presentation on Pope Francis from me before know that although there's a ton to say about Pope Francis, I tend to prefer to privilege his voice and to expose you to a lot of his words directly. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint, and I'll go ahead and share that with you. And I've broken every single rule on PowerPoint with this one because there are many quotations from the document itself. I see Connie, at least, and maybe a few others have pens or pencils. I would really like to encourage you to walk with me through the second half of this document, almost as what the tradition would call a lectio divina, a sacred reading shared, where we hold up together and contemplate, chew on, really digest the ideas and the invitations of this beautiful document, Fratelli Tutti. So last time, this is just a little repetition to kind of move us back into the same space. Last time I also noticed that this recent document, Fratelli Tutti, builds on a real legacy now that Pope Francis has developed over the course of 8 years in his pontificate. Few popes in history have written the number or depth and breadth of encyclicals that Francis now has. It's very accurate, I think, to use adjectives about Pope Francis like prolific and relevant, prophetic, and prayerful. And in fact, if we look at the next slide here and this kind of circle where I made those adjectives into quadrants, we could say that being relevant, prophetic, prolific, prayerful, prolific in the sense of being fruitful, in bearing fruit, through the witness of our lives, that this is truly a model of what Christian life for individuals as well as for communities should encompass. From the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Francis has modeled and called for solidarity. He understands that as a fundamental Christian attitude and disposition, that all Christians should be open-hearted and should seek to live in relationship with all human beings and with all creation. So we could certainly call Pope Francis the Pope of Solidarity, the one who preaches and models and embodies solidarity. And this document, Fratelli Tutti, is a deep and rigorous exploration, not only of solidarity, but of the next level of relationship, which we could call kinship, to be sisters and brothers to one another. So I just want to give you a brief sense of the reality with Francis, that solidarity is not a new concept for him, and that this document, while it explores solidarity, is not the first time that he has tried to open up what solidarity is, but also to invite us into solidarity with perhaps an increasing urgency, especially as we see the degradation of our environment and the erosion of our capacity as human beings to collaborate with one another. So he's aware and told us at the outset back in 2013 when he wrote Joy of the Gospel, there's a challenge of finding and sharing the mystery of living together, of mingling and encounter, of embracing and supporting one another, of stepping into this flood tide, which, while chaotic, can become a genuine experience of companionship, a caravan of solidarity, a sacred pilgrimage. So he's already suggesting that life itself is about journeying together, and that we journey well when we journey together, that the road of life is a long road, full of potholes and challenges, and we need one another in order to keep going in the journey of life. The Christian ideal, he wrote in Joy of the Gospel, will always be a summons to overcome suspicion, habitual mistrust, fear of losing our privacy, all the defensive attitudes which today's world imposes on us. So those are some of the challenges we face toward or to building deep and genuine relationships, not just with the people we like, but with all people, with the human family. This theme was repeated and developed even more in his important work, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, when he said outright, we need a new and universal solidarity. I think what he's suggesting here with the word new is that when we are in expansive and evolving relationship with one another, there's also always a certain newness and freshness that happens because of our relatedness and because of the development of our relatedness. And that's certainly the fruits of our relatedness is another theme of the second half of Fratelli Tutti. So let's begin in paragraph 115 of the document, where he describes, Pope Francis describes the value of solidarity. He says here that, some of us might begin the journey of solidarity through service. So solidarity may begin in service, but it never ends in service. And in fact, service is not equal to solidarity. Solidarity is always about, even as service should be always about, relationship and growing mutuality. An equality and a mutuality where both parties in relationship are mutually enriched. Solidarity finds concrete expression in service, he writes, which can take a variety of forms in an effort to care for others. And service, in great part, means caring for the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. In offering such service, individuals learn to set aside their own wishes and desires, their pursuit of power, before the concrete gaze of those who are most vulnerable. Service always looks to their faces, touches their flesh, senses their closeness, and even in some cases suffers that closeness and tries to help them. Service is never ideological, for we do not serve ideas, we serve people. And as those service relationships take on more frequency, more form, more flesh, we begin to know and to understand the challenges that others face and that we face. We begin to see that we have so much in common, both in what we suffer and in what we can celebrate. And so service often moves down a progression kind of a spectrum, if you will, toward solidarity. Let's see, there we go. Solidarity means much more, he says in the next paragraph, 116, than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. This is very interesting. So solidarity is not only about one individual connecting with another individual or individuals connecting with one another. It means beginning to get a sense of the communal whole and of what we have so often traditionally called the common good. Solidarity means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. Solidarity also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, and housing, the denial of social and labor rights. It means confronting the destructive effects of the empire of money. So in this section of the document, he's really articulating and giving us a very nuanced and detailed description of the qualities of solidarity. He then suggests some of the social and global implications of solidarity. If every human being possesses an inalienable dignity, if all people are my brothers and sisters, and if the world truly belongs to everyone, then it matters little whether my neighbor was born in my country or elsewhere. My own country also shares responsibility for his or her development, although it can fulfill that responsibility in a variety of ways. Before I continue with this section of the document, I want to recall for you, some of you may remember, and if you don't, you can go back into the document in chapter 2, where Pope Francis fleshes out the parable of the Good Samaritan, which of course is triggered by the question, who is my neighbor? And in that chapter, Francis has already developed very thickly the Christian understanding that neighbor is not a geographical concept. Neighbor is a human and a spiritual reality that transcends regionalism and concrete locality. And so now here, a chapter afterward, Pope Francis is trying to help us connect the reality of neighbor to our global reality. It can offer a generous welcome to those in urgent need or work to improve living conditions in their native lands by refusing to exploit those countries or to drain them of natural resources, backing corrupt systems that hinder the dignified development of their peoples. So that second, the quote is actually one long paragraph that I've broken up into these 3 bullet points, and I jumped into the second one here, which is another example of how we can live in solidarity with people globally. It's probably not the first example we might think of, where we think of the relationship between 2 people Or we think of a kind of a linking of two communities, sister communities. That so often happens, that parishes will take on a kind of sister community somewhere in the country or in another country. And again, those are also examples of solidarity, but they're not the only ways that we express solidarity. Here, I think Pope Francis is really challenging us to see that solidarity is a global, not just a global concept, but a global reality with many, many, many ways of being expressed. What applies to nations, which he's been going through in this paragraph, is true also for different regions within each country, since there too great inequalities often exist. So hopefully what you're beginning to wonder in your mind, or maybe even to observe, is that for Pope Francis, solidarity is a way of thinking about the human condition and the conditions in which all human beings live, and understanding both the diversity of those conditions and the inequities of those conditions. And where those inequities are clearly unjust, beginning to make a difference in those unjust spaces. So Pope Francis does not use this phrase, but I'd like to introduce it. In the next paragraph, he begins to talk about what I like to call the logic of solidarity. If solidarity is a reality, then you probably remember the word corollary, right? That was one of the ones I would trip over when I was, getting started in logic, right? A logical corollary, right? That there's a logic, and that, once you accept one premise, then there are certain related implications of that premise. So as we understand the reality of solidarity, there's a certain logic to it. And what he says right at the outset of paragraph 127, certainly all of this, all of the qualities of solidarity that he's been presenting, all of these qualities of solidarity call for an alternative way of thinking. Without an attempt to enter into that way of thinking, what I am saying here will sound wildly unrealistic. So some of the practices that he's suggesting are based on a paradigmatic understanding of solidarity. And therefore, we can begin to speak of what has often been called a paradigm shift, a change in a prevalent paradigm in which we aren't thinking, feeling, and acting in solidarity with one another, versus a reality in which we are thinking with, feeling with, and acting with one another. On the other hand, if we accept the great principle that there are rights born of our inalienable human dignity, we can rise to the challenge of envisaging a new humanity, a new way of being human, and a new way of being connected in our humanity, which is ultimately the core of this document. We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. This, he says, is the true path of peace, not the senseless and myopic strategy of sowing fear and mistrust in the face of outside threats. A real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. That's a biggie, and probably worth unpacking a little bit in conversation on your own, or even thinking through and praying with, to pull together the pieces and to see the implications of this logic of solidarity. So that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 builds on chapter 3. Whew. Like, okay, next step. And the next step is the step or the move from solidarity to kinship. If solidarity is our invitation to think relationally, to feel relationally, and to act relationally, then kinship is about how we do, think, feel, and act relationally out of a deepening sense of loving commitment. The kind of loving commitment that we would naturally and spontaneously and generously provide to a sister, a brother, a close friend. And that is how Francis says that all Christians should think of one another as sister, brother, close friend. If the conviction that all human beings are brothers and sisters is to find concrete embodiment, ... So there's the premise. All of you who've studied logic, okay, what's the conclusion? Things will have to change. What will have to change? If the conviction that all human beings are brothers and sisters is to find concrete embodiment, imagine in your mind some of the things that will have to change. How will we, and he uses 4 very concrete verbs that Pope Francis has introduced before. He introduced them as early as 2016 as he began the campaign to around migration and refugee accompaniment. How will we welcome, protect, promote, and integrate one another? Those are the 4 verbs that actuate our relationship with one another as sisters and brothers. And so he says, there's no way that we can implement welfare programs from the top down. Instead, the logic of kinship asks us to undertake a journey together through these 4 actions, that is, through welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating, in order to build cities and countries that, while preserving their respective cultural and religious identity, are open to differences and know how to promote them in the spirit of human kinship. He's actually asking us, he uses a really provocative phrase, which I invite you to think about a little bit more. He invites us to move from cultural sclerosis, right? That hardening of the arteries, that protectivism that keeps us from living toward one another and living with one another, into something more. So from cultural sclerosis, let's explore a little bit what he means by this. When we open our hearts to those who are different, this enables them, while continuing to be themselves, to develop in new ways. The different cultures that have flourished over the centuries need to be preserved, lest our world be impoverished. At the same time, all cultures should be encouraged to be open to new experiences through their encounter with other realities, for the risk of succumbing to cultural sclerosis is always present. That is, to using our culture and to using our humanity to build walls and to keep ourselves from being open, from changing, from evolving, from growing, and from all of the benefits that come as we learn more about one another and learn from one another. So we're invited to move from cultural sclerosis to a model that he calls reciprocal gifts. That is why, he continues in paragraph 134, we need to communicate with each other, to discover the gifts of each person, to promote that which unites us, and to regard our differences as an opportunity to grow in mutual respect. Patience and trust are called for in such dialogue, permitting individuals, families, and communities to hand on the values of their own culture and welcome the good that comes from others' experiences. So through communicating with each other, we learn what each person has to offer to the whole. we allow ourselves to share in one another's giftedness, and in that space, a much more profound human creativity can arise in the space between us and in our midst. So we get both, let's see, I'll go back, both reciprocal gifts and fruitful exchange. And here are some examples of fruitful exchange. Mutual assistance between countries provides enrichment for each. A country that moves forward while remaining solidly grounded in its original cultural substratum is a treasure for the whole of humanity. We need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. If we are troubled by the extinction of certain species, we should be all the more troubled that in some parts of our world, individuals or peoples are prevented from developing their potential and beauty by poverty or other structural limitations. In the end, this will impoverish us all. The world is interconnected by globalization. We need to attain a global juridical, political, and economic order, which can increase and give direction to international cooperation for the development of all peoples in solidarity. This is a huge call, obviously a challenge, but a deep invitation. And as we consider all of what we've seen through the course of the year 2020, the pandemic, and so much economic and social change. The reality that Pope Francis is suggesting that we all consider deeply, the awareness, as he has here in the middle of the first paragraph, that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved, becomes, I think, all the clearer to us. I just inserted this for a moment of a momentary pause to appreciate the beauty of encounter, of solidarity, and of literally mutual enrichment. I don't think that you could look at either face or even the face of the boy in the background and think that no one is not being really enriched by this encounter, by this exchange. So encounter provides an enrichment, a space in which 1 + 1 = more than 2. And this is part of what we're being asked and invited to explore as a reality, as a spiritual reality, and as a human reality, the only human reality, the only spiritual reality that can help humanity move forward, that can help us in our aspirations toward the values of the reign of God. So the next invitation in all of this is an invitation to live with what Pope Francis calls gratuitousness. I think of gratuitousness, or the way that I often talk about what I think is the same concept as generosity of spirit. To live with a generous spirit, but also in the spirit of generosity and with a generosity of spirit. So when Pope Francis has been talking about mutual enrichment, about this kind of fruitfulness of of gifts, he steps back from that, not backpedaling, but wanting to make sure he's very clear. This is not a tit for tat kind of exchange. It's not utilitarian. I do not wish, he writes, to limit this presentation to a kind of utilitarian approach. I'll give you this, you give me that, and we're both better off. There is always, he says, the factor of gratuitousness, the ability to do some things simply because they are good in themselves, without concern for personal gain or recompense. Think in your minds when you had one of those days when, as you look back at an event or several events in that day, you could sigh with a kind of joy almost and say, that was a good day. That was a good thing. And maybe there was some kind of compensation for it. Maybe there wasn't. It probably didn't matter to you in that moment of taking the consolation, if you will, of having done something that was good. That's what it is to live with gratuitousness. It is to actually enjoy the goodness of life, the goodness of being human, the goodness of being able to love. Life without fraternal gratuitousness, Pope Francis writes, becomes a form of frenetic commerce in which we are constantly weighing up what we give and what we get back in return. God, on the other hand, gives freely, to the point of helping even those who are unfaithful. He, quote, makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, unquote. Pope Francis continues, there is a reason why Jesus told us, when you give alms, do not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, so that your alms may be in secret. We received life freely, we paid nothing for it. Consequently, all of us are able to give without expecting anything in return, to do good to others without demanding that they treat us well in return. As Jesus told his disciples, without cost you have received, without cost you are to give. Gratuitousness, Pope Francis suggests, is the key to thriving, to moving from survival and survival of the fittest at that, to flourishing and human thriving. He writes in paragraph 141, the true worth of the different countries of our world is measured by their ability to think not simply as a country, but also as part of the larger human family. This is seen especially in times of crisis. Narrow forms of nationalism are an extreme expression of an inability to grasp the meaning of this gratuitousness. It's almost like, if you will, being miserly, and not just miserly in that economic sense, but miserly in every human sense. People who do that, countries who do that, err in thinking that they can develop on their own, he writes, heedless of the ruin of others, that by closing their doors to others, they will be better protected. Immigrants are seen as usurpers who have nothing to offer. This leads to the simplistic belief that the poor are dangerous, useless, while the powerful are generous benefactors. Well, we've seen the fallacy of some of that thinking. Only a social and political culture that readily and gratuitously welcomes others will have a future. Powerful things to contemplate. Mutual enrichment. He reminds us that a healthy openness never threatens one's own identity, individually, communally, nationally. Instead, he writes, a living culture, enriched by elements from other places, does not import a mere carbon copy of those new elements, but integrates them in its own unique way. The result is a new synthesis that is ultimately beneficial to all, since the original culture itself ends up being nourished. And he concludes with this beautiful sentence, the world grows and is filled with new beauty, thanks to the successive syntheses produced between cultures that are open and free of any form of cultural imposition. Growth and beauty come from this continual, ongoing synthesis. To see things in this way brings the joyful realization that no one people, culture, or individual can achieve everything on its own. To attain fulfillment in life, we need others. I want to go back and just reread and highlight, underscore, because there's one adjective in that sentence that's could be a surprise adjective, right? To see things in this way brings the joyful realization that no one people, culture, or individual can achieve everything on its own. To attain fulfillment in life, we need others. Hopefully that reread helped, if it didn't jump up the first time, helped you notice the word joyful. How many of you feel joyous when you're incompetent? How many of you like the fact that you're insufficient? That alone, you can't do everything you'd like to do. Pope Francis says, we can take some joy in that. We don't have to be defensive about that or arrogant about with the assumption that we are enough. None of us individually is enough as an individual person, and no single culture is enough. And that's part of the reality of being human. And to realize that not only with humility, but with a new option, not the option of, oh my gosh, then I'm just going to kind of crumple over and die because I'm insufficient, but to see that as an invitation to stretch into relationship, to grow, to learn, and to be enriched by relationship. That's the joyful invitation in all of this. An awareness of our own limitations and incompleteness, far from being a threat, becomes the key to envisaging, to being able to see and pursue common projects. So instead of feeling crippled by our incompetence, we can actually embrace and imagine new possibilities in and through these relationships that we're forming, because we are now committed to solidarity, the way that he's has defined it for us in chapter 3, and kinship, the way that he's unpacking that for us here in chapter 4. Okay, guess what? We have several more chapters. I hope so far so good. They do build on one another, and almost at this point, almost now that we've done solidarity and kinship, which is kind of like the deepening of relationship, now he's going to explore how, because we are rooted and grounded in these relationships, the implications, the logic of solidarity and the logic of kinship can expand outwardly into a different way of being social and political. So in chapter 5, he takes up the theme of a better kind of politics. And at this point, it would almost seem that no matter what your politics or your political perspective, you've probably reached some, at least asking the question, if not coming to the conclusion, that there's got to be a better kind of politics than some of what we've seen. So here are some of Pope Francis's invitations to us to think about these questions. The development of a global community based on the practice of social friendship on the part of peoples and nations calls for a better kind of politics, one truly at the service of the common good. So if you don't remember anything more, know that this document is all about unpacking in very both concrete and larger picture understandings of what the common good is in the 21st century and what it might look like and what it will require of us relationally as a people. Sadly, he says, politics today often takes forms that hinder progress towards a different world. A living and dynamic people, a people with a future. And see, for Pope Francis, that those two things are deeply interconnected. If we are not a dynamic people, that is, if we are not open to change, if we are not able to integrate change, even as we maintain our core values, then we will not have a future. A living and dynamic people, a people with a future, is one constantly open to a new synthesis through its ability to welcome differences. In this way, it does not deny its proper identity, but is open to being mobilized, challenged, broadened, and enriched by others, and thus to further growth and development. If you recall at the very beginning of this presentation, I framed it with the analogy or the metaphor of journeying together. It's probably helpful to remember that journeying together, that caravan of solidarity that Pope Francis mentioned as early as 2013 in Joy of the Gospel. He is now asking us to be a pilgrim people, to be a people on the move with clarity about values, but open to all that happens along the journey of life, the journey of human history, and the global journey that we are on together. Okay. As he considers this, the political implications of solidarity, he also holds up a tremendously important question. I think we've seen this so deeply in the year 2020 with the pandemic and so many challenges to all of us, but especially to how nations are led. Another sign of the decline of popular leadership is concern for short-term advantage. One meets popular demands for the sake of gaining votes or support, but without advancing in an arduous and constant effort to generate the resources people need to develop and earn a living by their own efforts and creativity. Eliminating inequality requires an economic growth that can help to tap each region's potential and thus guarantee a sustainable equality. So he really wants us to question whether or not short-term thinking and survivalist thinking is leadership at all. But rather, when we think about the common good, and we think about that common good as not simply a present reality, but also a future reality, we have to think about leadership in terms of the sustainability of the models that leaders are embodying and that they are bringing and putting into action structurally. On everyone's mind, and of course on Pope Francis's as well, is the issue of work, the goodness of human labor, and compensation in the form of just wages for that labor. The biggest issue is employment. The truly popular thing, since it promotes the good of the people, is to provide everyone with the opportunity to nurture the seeds that God has planted in each of us, our talents, our initiative, and our innate resources. If each of us has an inalienable dignity and a giftedness to offer to the world, then that giftedness needs to be nurtured and cultivated and also appreciated in the realm of labor and of what labor produces globally. I'm putting a fancy Greek word up at the top here, metanoia, but I would suggest to you that metanoia is behind the entirety of this document, which is all about the change of heart, attitudes, and lifestyles that this pandemic moment in particular calls out of us. Everything then, Pope Francis writes, depends on our ability to see the need for a change of heart, attitudes, and lifestyles. Otherwise, political propaganda, the media, and the shapers of public opinion will continue to promote an individualistic and uncritical culture subservient to unregulated economic interests and societal institutions at the service of those who already enjoy too much power. The bigger risk has to do with human weakness, the proclivity to selfishness that is part of what the Christian tradition refers to as concupiscence, the human inclination to be concerned only with myself, my group, my own petty interests. Concupiscence is not a flaw limited to our own day. It has been present from the beginning of humanity and has simply changed and taken on different forms down the ages, using whatever means each moment of history can provide. So I think particularly when you think about consumption in today's world, um, consumption is one of the ways that the modern/postmodern world has really lived out this concupiscence, which he promises concupiscence, however, can be overcome with the help of God. And that's one of the critical elements of the human journey, to overcome concupiscence in favor of gratuitousness, of generosity of spirit, of rejoicing in every outgrowth, every crack of growth through the pavement of goodness that we see and notice and celebrate. All signs and activities of goodness in our world. That's the opposite of concupiscence, in which we're more miserly, where we're more self-interested, egocentric, etc., etc. The politics we need, that's actually the subheading of several paragraphs in this chapter. The politics we need. Paragraph 177 says, well, what is needed is a politics which is far-sighted and capable of a new, integral, and interdisciplinary approach to handling the different aspects of the crisis of our day. In other words, a healthy politics capable of reforming and coordinating institutions, promoting best practices, and overcoming undue pressure and bureaucratic inertia. We cannot expect economics to do this, nor can we allow economics to take over the real power of the state. The long-term common good. In the face of many petty forms of politics focused on immediate interests, I would repeat, Pope Francis says, that true statecraft is manifest when in difficult times we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. True statecraft is manifest when in difficult times we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. Thinking of those who will come after us does not serve electoral purposes, yet it is what authentic justice demands, he writes. As the bishops of Portugal have taught, the earth is lent to each generation to be handed on to the generation that follows. So thinking about the common good, not simply as the current reality and how our current reality is experienced globally, but also thinking about it in terms of sustainability, in terms of the intergenerational dimensions of creation. This was a theme that Pope Francis explored beautifully as well in Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home, where he devoted several paragraphs to what he called intergenerational solidarity. Intergenerational solidarity. And he gave the example of indigenous cultures who, as they discern, as they make decisions about how they're going to do what they're going to do, they try to think 7 generations down the line. What will the impact of this decision be 7 generations forward? Imagine the kind of politics that we would have if we had intergenerational solidarity and this commitment to the next generation, the next several generations. This is part of what Pope Francis wants us to integrate in how we think and how we behave politically and socially. The urgency of the threat. I think Pope Francis is very clear that there's a certain urgency about the need for a new way of thinking and doing politics. He says, we are still far from a globalization of the most basic of human rights. That is why world politics needs to make the effective elimination of hunger one of its foremost and imperative goals. Indeed, when financial speculation manipulates the price of food, treating it as just another commodity, millions of people suffer and die from hunger. At the same time, tons of food are thrown away. This constitutes a genuine scandal. Hunger is criminal. Food is an inalienable right. And again, in paragraph 189, often as we carry on our semantic or ideological disputes, we allow our brothers and sisters to die of hunger and thirst without shelter or access to health care. I mean, in some ways, he's simply holding up our reality for us, with us, and helping us ask the questions, what is wrong with this picture? And I know so many of you, I know some of you surely must have been over the past several months asking yourself the same, what is wrong with us? And here I think we're being given enough analysis and enough hard truths to start really thinking carefully about who we want to be, who we are becoming, who we have become, who we can become, if and as we embrace solidarity and kinship, thinking about one another as sisters and brothers, feeling with one another as sisters, brothers, and friends. Alongside these basic needs that remain unmet, he continues, trafficking in persons represents another source of shame for humanity, one that international politics, moving beyond fine speeches and good intentions, must no longer tolerate. These things are essential. They can no longer be deferred. So he's asking us to measure ourselves in terms of some of the most egregious problems that continue to exist, and continue to exist not in tiny pockets here and there. When you know the demographics, when you know the numbers of people suffering hunger, suffering trafficking for that matter, without shelter or access to health care, it should give us pause. It should have us question, how can we do better? How can we collaborate and be creative about problems that threaten so many of our sisters and brothers? Sowing seeds of goodness. That's kind of the flip side. That politics and how we think socially and politically can actually be an opportunity to sow seeds of goodness, to create, to nurture, to cultivate. And so he writes in paragraph 196, it is truly noble to place our hope in the hidden power of the seeds of goodness we sow, and thus to initiate processes whose fruits will be reaped by others. So many of you, I know from your professional lives, as teachers, as social workers, as people who accompany others in so many ways. There are so many examples of unknown seeds that you have sown and that you don't know how they've grown on the other side. But each act of investment in the lives of other people, however that happens in our day-to-day activities, all of that is exactly what Pope Francis is talking about in this paragraph, sowing seeds of goodness. Good politics, he says, combines love with hope and with confidence in the reserves of goodness present in human hearts. Indeed, authentic political life, built upon respect for law and frank dialogue between individuals, is constantly renewed whenever there is a realization that every woman and man and every new generation brings the promise of new relational, intellectual, cultural, and spiritual energies. So here I think he's reminding us of human potential. That when all is said and done, if we are indeed created in the image of God, the image and likeness of God, there is a potential embedded in us for goodness, a potential that we need to discover and that we need to grow and cultivate in ourselves and in one another. That's the experiment of the reign of God that we're all called toward. So in paragraph 197, he introduces some very concrete questions. And he says the real and potentially painful questions will be. So, what every human being needs to be asking herself or himself are these questions. How much love did I put into my work? Whatever that work was. What did I do for the progress of our people? What mark did I leave on the life of society? What real bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash? How much social peace did I sow? What good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? I think anyone who has considered one or more of these questions and has been able to answer these questions in concrete ways knows experientially what it is to be an instrument of goodness, of light, and of hope in the world. This is something that can't be bought. And ultimately, I think Bernard of Clairvaux would say it best, it is its own reward. There is no way to put a price tag or to compensate a person for that, what Pope Francis was calling before gratuitousness, that generous spirit that puts love into work, that brings a personal presence into relationships, whether they're personal or professional. That is the work of sowing goodness in the soil of humanity. And ultimately, that is the joy and blessing of collaborating with the divine in our midst. And that's the invitation of this document. Okay, chapter 6, interestingly, explores dialogue and asks us how we'll begin to take some of the first few steps toward creating a world, a society that is rooted in invested relationships. By invested relationships, think sisters, brothers, friends. How can we, each of us, take some of these first steps forward? Well, one easy, or maybe not so easy, especially given all that we've seen in terms of debate, of polemic, of even hate speeches or hate speech that we've seen. One basic and fundamental step is to commit to dialogue. And he spends some time defining authentic dialogue at the beginning of this new chapter 6. Dialogue, he says, is often confused with something quite different. The feverish exchange of opinions on social networks, frequently based on media information that is not always reliable. These exchanges are merely parallel monologues. They may attract some attention by their sharp and aggressive tone, or how clever they are, right? And then they get retweeted and retweeted and retweeted. But monologues engage no one, and their content is frequently self-serving and contradictory. Indeed, he continues, the media's noisy potpourri of facts and opinions is often an obstacle to dialogue, since it lets everyone cling stubbornly to his or her own ideas, interests, and choices with the excuse that everyone else is wrong. It becomes easier to discredit and insult opponents from the outset than to open a respectful dialogue aimed at achieving agreement on a deeper level, also aimed at exploring commonality. And so, another step that we can take, and another reality and approach to life that Pope Francis has been suggesting and modeling for the 8 years now of his pontificate, is to create a culture of encounter. To speak of a culture of encounter means that we as a people should be passionate about meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. This becomes an aspiration and a style of life. The subject of this culture is the people, not simply one part of society that would pacify the rest with the help of professional and media resources. The fruit of a culture of encounter brings enduring stability. Integrating differences is a much more difficult and slow process, yet it is the guarantee of a genuine and lasting peace. What is important, he continues in this section, is to create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences. Let us arm our children with the weapons, quote unquote, of dialogue. Let us teach them to fight the good fight of the culture of encounter. Another concrete thing that we can do to sow seeds is that we can choose to cultivate kindness. And in paragraph 223, Pope Francis develops that, referring back to Galatians and St. Paul, describing kindness as a fruit of the Holy Spirit, an attitude that is gentle, pleasant, and supportive, not rude or coarse. Individuals who possess this quality help make other people's lives more bearable, especially by sharing the weight of their problems, needs, and fears. This way of treating others can take different forms: an act of kindness, a concern not to offend by word or deed, a readiness to alleviate burdens. It involves speaking words of comfort, strength, consolation, and encouragement, not words that demean, sadden, anger, or show scorn. So, in this simple act of communication, we can already begin to cultivate a different culture and a different way of interacting as human beings and as a human family. Each day, he says, and I'm going back to an earlier part of the document, provides us with a new opportunity, a new possibility. So he encourages us to embrace each day as a fresh start and a new invitation to take an active part in renewing and supporting our troubled societies. Today, we have a great opportunity to express our innate sense of fraternity, to be good Samaritans who bear the pain of other people's troubles, rather than fomenting greater hatred and resentment. Like the chance traveler in the parable, we need only have a pure and simple desire to be a people, a community constant and tireless in the effort to include, integrate, and lift up the fallen. 2 more chapters left. The last one, chapter 8, is very brief. But chapter 7 is about paths of renewed encounter and how the culture of encounter is ultimately the path to peace. I called this section of the document Lessons of Peace, because in it, I think Pope Francis goes to specific parts of the world that have suffered lack of peace to see what can be learned. You might even call this section of the document Lessons from the Trenches. So let's see what we can learn about peace from people who have had to learn about peace because they have not always had peace in their midst. The bishops of South Africa, he writes, have pointed out that true reconciliation is achieved proactively by forming a new society, a society based on service to others rather than the desire to dominate, a society based on sharing what one has with others rather than the selfish scramble by each for as much wealth as possible, A society in which the value of being together as human beings is ultimately more important than any lesser group, whether it be family, nation, race, or culture. As the bishops of South Korea have pointed out, true peace can be achieved only when we strive for justice through dialogue, pursuing reconciliation and mutual development. Those who work for tranquil social coexistence should never forget that inequality and lack of integral human development make peace impossible. So I imagine some of you had this, or maybe still have this bumper sticker on your car: if you want peace, work for justice. Indeed, without equal opportunities, different forms of aggression and conflict will find a fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. Paragraph 235. Here's another element about, and it reflects the astuteness, I think, of Pope Francis's understanding of peacemaking. It's a situation that I think is increasingly one that we need to be thinking about and praying about. That cultivating peace does not mean appeasing. That the strategy of appeasement is not, as particularly when there is oppression, is not a peacemaking strategy. So he says in paragraph 241, nor does this mean, peacemaking does not mean calling for forgiveness when it involves renouncing our own rights, confronting corrupt officials, criminals, or those who would debase our dignity. We are called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us or letting him think that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of a power that he does not know how to use and that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. Forgiveness does not entail allowing oppressors to keep trampling on their own dignity and that of others, or letting criminals continue their wrongdoing. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family, precisely because they must preserve the dignity that they have received as a loving gift from God. If a criminal has harmed me or a loved one, no one can forbid me from demanding justice and ensuring that this person or anyone else will not harm me or others again. This is entirely just. Forgiveness does not forbid it, but actually demands it. So as we wrestle with and grapple with concepts like mercy, reconciliation, and forgiveness, we're not supposed to take everything that's been said already about justice and the importance of inclusion and guaranteeing dignity and the dignity of all out of the equation, out of our activity. The important thing, he says right after this paragraph, is not to fuel anger, which is unhealthy for our own soul and for the soul of our people, or to become obsessed with taking revenge and destroying the other. No one achieves inner peace or returns to a normal life in that way. The truth is that no family, no group of neighbors, no ethnic group, much less a nation, has a future if the force that unites them, brings them together, and resolves their differences is vengeance and hatred. We cannot come to terms and unite for the sake of revenge, or treating others with the same violence with which they treated us, or plotting opportunities for retaliation under apparently legal auspices. Nothing is gained this way, and in the end, everything is lost. So now we're seeing that another corollary and logic of solidarity and kinship is the hard work of peacemaking and justice making. So he leaves this section by looking at the scourge of war as something that is so destructive physically and spiritually, to the human community that we must do all that is possible, not just to avoid war, but to build a just global family. Every war, he writes, leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence, look at reality through their eyes, and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war, nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing and working for peace. So he asks for an end to violence as an intrinsic commitment to solidarity and and kinship. I ask those, he says, tempted to yield to violence in any form, to keep in mind the words of the book of Isaiah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. For us, this prophecy took flesh in Christ Jesus, who, seeing a disciple tempted to violence, said firmly, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." The final chapter, chapter 8, explores briefly the role of religions, not just Christianity, but the world religions, at the service of solidarity, peace, and kinship. And it's really an invitation. Let us dream then, as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. Okay, that's a pretty thorough review. Let's see, stop share. Yes. Okay. Of the document. I hope I haven't put you to sleep with all of that. It's an extensive, it's almost like a tour de force, a symphonic description of the ethics of and the spirituality of solidarity and kinship, of what it is to be human and to be fruitfully related and connected to one another. I wonder if there were phrases from the document that really struck you, ideas that struck you, thoughts, questions that you want to share.
And I would encourage, if folks do have any questions, if you want to put those into the chat box, go ahead, and then I can go ahead and share those with Dr. Ahlgren. But in the meantime, I have some questions here that to put out there for you, as perhaps people reflect on their own questions and add those. So a question for you is, how do you see the insights of Fratelli Tutti impacting the life of our Bellarmine community, specifically creating the culture of encounter, belonging, and solidarity that you discussed?
Well, as a very long time member of the Bellarmine community, I feel that I can speak from the community and not just to the community. And I know from my experience of the community how deeply committed individuals and we as a community are to the culture of encounter and to solidarity. How this impacts us, I think, particularly as we move out of the pandemic, is to continue to explore ways of fruitfully collaborating with one another in small communities as well as in the larger scale of things, sharing where our struggles are, sharing our needs, and sharing our gifts, sharing our giftedness, so that in our conversations, we can think creatively about how to implement change in all dimensions and areas of our lives, individually and communally, and how to model change and model possibility to the larger community of Cincinnati and beyond. I think we all know that when you see something being made possible, it's so much easier not only to imagine that possibility, but to become a little more hopeful and committed to that possibility and to the change in you that make things possible. And so we create hope. We create hope in the human community and hope in human goodness. And we create, I think, hope in and faith in the activity of God in the midst of the human community when we do that. And that's a very, very powerful witness.
Thank you so much. Perhaps another question is, what does Fratelli Tutti have to say to us in this specific historical moment of pandemic and deep polarization and political turmoil?
Turmoil. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I covered that a bit in the first section because Pope Francis really, he's very, very good at doing what the Jesuits call a composition of place, right? Which means to look long and lovingly at our world and at our current reality and to address that current reality, not to address kind of pie in the sky abstractions, but to really look around and say, what do we need? Where are we suffering? What needs to happen? And the pandemic has made many of those needs really, really clear. The need to collaborate, the need to pool our resources, intellectual, scientific, in order to stay ahead of a virus that is mutating and that is providing variants. And this virus is going to keep us on, and this is one virus. This virus is going to keep us on our feet for a long time. So the document speaks, I think, very directly. So I want to break your question, which is a great question, into two sections, right? The pandemic section and the turmoil section, right? Because both of those are parallel interlocking crises, right? And I don't think I heard mention of the environmental crisis that is, again, kind of parallel and intertwined. And this document is really basically suggesting a way of proceeding, a way of growing into our relationality, but also the potential that being people in fruitful relationship with one another unleashes in this current historical moment. So we are being hit with profound challenges, not just the pandemic challenge, but also with profound social and political challenges. The extremities of inequity, especially economic inequity, we've been seeing that over the past decade, and we've been seeing that divide grow exponentially. Now that we're moving out of the pandemic, it's very clear that the political and social instability of that economic equation is not viable for us going forward. What are we going to do about that? And if our conversation, it's not even conversation, what did he call it? He's the monologue. It was wasn't that a great phrase? Somebody tell me what that one was, right? That was it. Parallel monologues, right? I mean, if basically our conversations are parallel monologues, then we need to recover the very basics of dialogue. Understanding that dialogue involves listening, not just speaking. Because these are very, very basic expressions of relationship, and that we have a lot to learn individually and communally as we engage these practices and these habits. So that too may go some distance. Basically, I'm going to type it into the chat, but you're probably, this Jesuit parish, and we all kind of know our Ignatian speak, right? That Ignatian spirituality and Ignatius spiritual exercises was intended to give people a way of proceeding, a way of exploring their humanity and a way of growing as human beings. And I think that that's precisely what this document is doing. It's trying to propose a new way of proceeding, a way that's not entirely new. It's clearly, obviously, gospel based. So there's nothing new about it. But yet at another level, it would generate a new form of solidarity if we were to begin to engage those steps.
Thank you. So we have a question here. Has there been any significant feedback regarding this encyclical from other organized faiths?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't have enough concrete information to give you a lot of examples there. But I can say, yes, there has been significant, first of all, there was significant dialogue that preceded the encyclical, and that the encyclical itself is intended to serve as a stimulus not only for conversation, dialogue, and growth within Christianity and in ecumenism within Christianity, but also amongst the world religious traditions. The pandemic has made some of that dialogue a little bit more challenging, and the convening of larger dialogues. There's been a lot that was canceled, including a major conference in Assisi on the economy of Francesco that eventually had to be done via Zoom. So we'll see in 2021 and 2022 how these dialogues continue to expand. But even still, we can certainly all do our part by thinking about this document, by studying it, by praying with it, by talking about it with other people, by putting it into action ourselves so that we begin to model the principles. And then we can gradually have increasing conversations, not only with those of us in our own community, but with other Christians and with other other faiths.
Thank you. We have a few questions rolling in. I know we're coming upon time, but I'm gonna try to get some of these in here.
Sure.
Does Pope Francis say anything about the need for all nations to support, strengthen, and transform the United Nations, which seems our best chance at creating global order to solve our many global problems? And the questioner recognizes that John the 23rd had encouraged support in one of his encyclicals.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for asking that question. And I do apologize. There are at least two, if not three paragraphs specifically devoted to the United Nations and to, kind of an enhancement, a revitalization of the United Nations in the 21st century that are really important in this document. So, yes, looking at like global instruments, global organizations, and particularly the United Nations to foster dialogue and to promote the culture of encounter, and also to look at pressing issues of human rights and of environmental challenges, and to provide a mechanism for continuing not only the dialogue, but of course the collaboration.
Thank you. So our next one, it starts off, I was glad to read the chapter on politics and imagine a new kind of politics. In the meantime, though, what would you say to those who are disgusted by the way politics are run now?
What would I say? Oh boy, but we're recording. No, sorry. Well, I think that probably many of us can relate to what in Spanish they might call a disgusto, kind of bitter taste in the mouth of where we are politically at this point. And yet, that disillusionment, that frustration, that fatigue, and even the kind of potentially that kind of moral outrage. I had at least an hour and a half conversation recently with my son about the whole notion of public service, and where political office is not something that involves privilege, but is in point of fact a service. So the disillusionment, I think, is widespread and quite possibly well deserved, because we are seeing people in office who are doing precisely, I think, what Pope Francis is denouncing in the document. They are misusing positions of power by not seeking and advocating and promoting the common good, and not engaging in the kinds of dialogue and conversation that would enable us not only to consider, but to move toward a deeper common good and a deeper empowerment of people's giftedness, which is ultimately what being human is all about, and certainly what being of service to people is. So I would say, don't give up hope. There are some principles here that you can not only think about, but you can talk about, and we can ask for more. We can begin. I mean, do you remember the section? I think it was paragraph 241, in which says, peacemaking doesn't happen when you appease the oppressor. You do have to challenge. When you see someone abusing power, whether that's an abuse of power in an in an interpersonal relationship, or in some kind of relationship, or in political office, you can ask for more, right? We can begin to really try to hold others, and certainly ourselves, but others, accountable to public service and to what it is to be an elected official in a space of leadership, when the challenges that we face are so deep and so threatening to so many people. We need accountability in that space. So what can we do? We can think about the principles in the document. We can continue to perpetuate dialogue around the common good, and we can demand that our elected officials actually consider the common good and work toward the common good. That's a start anyway.
Thank you so much. Seeing that we're about to hit on our time here, but thank you. You started off asking us to treat this like Lectio Divina, and so I think it's now time for us to meditate on everything that you've shared. So much wonderful content. So thank you just for allowing us this opportunity to explore and go into a deeper relationship with one another. And thank you to all those who joined this evening. This Zoom will be available as a recording on the Bellarmine Chapel YouTube channel in a few days. So please feel free to share this with others, or if you would like to revisit certain points, know that will be available here soon. So thank you all, and thank you, Gillian.
Thanks again. It was so great to be with all of you. Take good care. Be well.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.
All right.